debate one day after the attack near the Woolwich military barracks that killed a 25-year-old British soldier. 2 men in custody. We're talking about the trend in homegrown terrorism with, from the UK capital, Brooke Rogers, who teaches in risk and terror at King's College London. From Madrid, Frank Foley joins us. He's the author of Countering Terrorism in Britain and France. With us here in the studio, sociologist Farhad Khosrow-Kavar, author of Inside Jihadism, and France 24's Georgia Calvin-Smith, who last year covered the siege in that southwestern city of Toulouse of Mohammed Merah. Just before the break, Frank Foley was talking about all that's changed since 9/11. Again, what we witnessed on Wednesday in London was the first Islamist killing on British soil since the 7/7 attack of July 2005. Brooke Rogers, what's changed in the UK since then?
Quite a bit has changed in the UK in terms of regulations and also in terms of community engagement. So in respect to accessing, let's say, materials such as chemicals for the fertilizer plot that we had over here, or large amounts of hydrogen peroxide or materials that you would need in order to construct a bomb, they have programs such as the Know Your Customer program that has been rolled out by the security services in order to engage the different industries and the different shops that would actually be selling these materials to customers. Unfortunately, it has been quite a successful program, but those who are interested in conducting acts of terror have grown wise to it. And we saw, for example, with the 7/7 bombers, that instead of buying large quantities of material from shops, that they would go to many different shops in order to accumulate enough in order to make their bombs. So that's more on the legislation front. We've also seen very, very successful engagement on the community level, for example, from the local authority prevent coordinators who go out and engage with communities. We've also seen some more security-based interventions from the policing world in terms of the Channel Project, so it's early intervention. And we know nowadays that communities, if they do have a problem, especially if we're now focusing in, which unfortunately we do with this type of conversation at the moment, focusing on some of the Muslim communities, they now realize that if they do have an issue, that instead of addressing that issue, addressing the person who's sending out the extremist messages and then moving them along to another community, they know that there are channels that they can use in order to report this and to intervene. So they've become much, much more powerful.
Farhad Khosrow-Kavar, when you listen to what Brooke Rogers is describing as all the measures, do you also have a sense of, because on the one hand you can't put someone to monitor every single phone conversation. There are civil liberties issues, if anything, associated with that. What do you think that the balance is right now? Is it the right one between defending the public but not infringing too much on people's privacy?
There's a change in the pattern of terrorism. We have to take it into account. The 2001, September 11, 2001 style is finished. You cannot have it anymore unless there is a major failure in intelligence services in the West. Otherwise, impossible. Impossible to have 19 people, just getting organized and blowing up, towers and so on. It's due to this fact that now we have small groups, either lone wolves or 2 or 3 people, not more than that. You see it in civil society and you see it in prisons. You cannot go beyond that without being identified, without being, just identified by the intelligence services, because you don't have to use cell phones, you don't have to use internet and so on. You can be influenced, but that's why being on the radar doesn't change so much. In many cases, Merah or one of these killers, you have them, being somehow supervised by some people. Doesn't change because you cannot supervise 10,000 people, at the same time for the same type of, attitude. Otherwise, democracy is at stake, So
So there will be times when you'll stop monitoring, and
the problem is that one has to change the style and work from within the communities. It's not a question of government, identifying these people. It's a question of civil society and communities within the civil society who should understand that this type of terrorism is, first of all, against themselves, because nowadays Muslims are going to suffer a lot in Great Britain, Islamophobia, and racism and so on. And second, it's a very bad thing for democracy. So we have to make them much more aware of what's going on in order for them to supervise these people. And then there's another factor which is changing, and it's that you have more and more, I would say, unbalanced people, psychologically fragile people, who become involved in that type of terrorism. When it was a large group like Al-Qaeda, September the 11th, they were not at all fragile. They were very rational. Nowadays, since there is no group supervision on them, they become much more, prone to some kind of psychopathic relationship. And Mera was psychologically fragile, and it was recognized by one of the psychologists. In prison, we have many people who have the same problem. And my guess is that these young guys, have problems. So they become much more easily involved in terrorist action because they don't have to be within a group.
What I find interesting is that these guys are going out and carrying out grand terrorist gestures in the hope of changing foreign policy. But what we're seeing is it's domestic policy in terms of encouraging communities to spot fragile individuals like this. It's actually been reinforced by government. And that's right, because it's grassroots that you find these individuals who are falling off the radar and coming up with these crazy plans by themselves to create some grand gesture that they're hoping will achieve something. Or what probably they actually need is somebody to supervise them and say, look,
right.
there's an alternative.
Let me add something into the mix. The Associated Press reporting that the British police say 2 more people have been arrested, a man and a woman. And they are suspected, according to counterterrorism officers, of conspiracy to murder, both in custody in a South London police station. Frank Foley, just like with the Boston bombings of last month, we now see that there are people, and we're still a bit fuzzy. Were these people accessories? Did they conspire because they knew and kept their mouths shut? It's unclear at this point, but can we say for good, now that there are 2 more arrests, that these are not lone wolves as such?
Yes, I think we can say they're not lone wolves. Even in the case of Mohammed Merah, where everybody thought initially that this was a classic case of a lone wolf, and the French intelligence services certainly put out that story to try to distract from their failures on the case. We found eventually that Merah had a lot of contacts, ideological contacts, and certainly to get yourself into the position mentally where you're going to do something like this, you cannot be a lone wolf in most cases. You need to talk with people, you need to share your ideas. You may keep your violent ideas to yourself or within a small group, but there needs to be a broader network of at least ideological support. It may be that there was a network which provided support for violent action. We'll have to wait and see.
French newspaper Libération publishing a story earlier this week, Frank Foley, saying, describing what it called the new generation jihad, starting with another convert, Gilles Le Guen, 58 years old, alias Abdel Jalil. He was recently arrested by French-led forces in Mali. These guys seem to be traveling, going to places like Syria.
Yes, I mean, that's a pattern we've seen for a decade now. We've seen young British men going to Pakistan, getting terrorist training, coming back and trying to attack in the UK. We've seen people going to Afghanistan or the Pakistani or Afghanistan border from France, coming back, getting involved in violent networks in France. So it's not surprising. In fact, if some people have said that the Arab Spring, a whole wave of peaceful protest initially was leaving behind this kind of jihadist behavior because it was showing the power of peaceful protest. But unfortunately, what's happening in Syria has the potential to have history repeating itself once again, whereby young men go out to fight in Syria and they may or may not get radicalized. The question is, what do they do when they come home, if they come home?
All right, certainly the power vacuum there attracting these kinds of people. Farhad Khosrowkava, are we, these people again, are we talking about dozens, hundreds, thousands of people?
When it comes to the new, jihadists who go to, let's say, Afghanistan or Pakistan or there, their number is reduced compared to the time, when they went by thousands. But 100 of them are enough, because sufficient have one or two who would commit a kind of, terrorist act for societies to become, boiling with indignation. And now we have another phenomenon, for instance, among the Tunisians. There are more than 1,000 who seem to have gone to Syria. So some of them might come back and come to Europe. So in that respect, one can say there is a change of pattern, because the number of people who get involved, for instance, in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Mali, the French, English, or others, is by far less numerous than what happened, in the 1990s, when Europeans went there, by thousands, because there was not any kind of, I would say, limits to that. Nowadays, intelligence services are much more aware of that.
And monitoring much more. I also want to get back to a point that Brooke Rogers made at the outset about how in this particular case, the two attackers certainly very internet aware. And while one conservative columnist says what happened is straight out of the Al-Qaeda terror manual, Frank Ferretti, writing an op-ed piece in The Independent, said it's unlikely that the two men who perpetrated this despicable act of violence have been busy reading Al-Qaeda's terror manual. However, there is little doubt they are thoroughly immersed in the cultural values of reality entertainment. Brooke Rogers, do you share that opinion?
I do, and I think that Frank quite often hits the nail on the head in terms of his assessment of the situations. I do think that they have been thoroughly immersed. I'm not convinced from an earlier comment. I think perhaps I miscommunicated that they did not expect to engage with members of the public. I think that they understood that members of the public would be filming them and that they wanted to speak to members of the public in order to get their messages across. I'd also like to engage a little bit, if I may, with the issue of this psychological fragility, and I think that we would refer to it as vulnerability over here. All of the literature from this end is showing that these are actually quite rational actors, rational beings, and we do sometimes on occasion see someone who might have some issues being taken into a group and acting on behalf of a group. But overall, if they did have some psychological illnesses or psychological issues, they wouldn't really have been able to stay under the radar as well as they did. I think you have to be very savvy, very technologically savvy, if that's how they're doing their research, and very controlled in order to actually plan these incidents without others spreading the word or finding out. Now, it does look like there might be some involvement, or maybe some people who knew a little bit more than they should and didn't say anything, but I do not think that these men are psychologically unsound.
I don't think psychologically unsound is necessarily the issue here. I think having psychological issues is different from being psychologically unsound. The disenfranchisement is in itself a psychological issue. If people are frustrated and angry and they don't know where to channel these feelings, they are that inherently makes them vulnerable in a way. That is not an excuse, that is not a justification, but at the same time, I don't think that it is helpful to ignore the fact that there are certain social factors that mean that people, particularly at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, who perhaps feel that they don't know where they fit in, are not more vulnerable to not falling off the wagon, but turning towards radicalism in the way that we've seen with Mera and in Boston and in London.
At the same time, you can be a psychopath and be very manipulative. Psychopaths are very good at that. And then for Mera's case, for instance, we know for sure that he had problems, psychological problems. And for many others, in prison, I've been doing this research. There are lots of people who have psychological problems and are at the same time very good at radicalizing the others. So that these are not contradictory.
All right, just very briefly, two other points to touch on. Obviously, the political backlash. It's given a lot of attention to the far-right nationalist English Defence League, which gathered late Wednesday in Woolwich, singing nationalistic songs, shouting obscenities about the Quran. Their leaders in the past few days even had been vocal.
Enough's enough. Our message is enough. We have weak leaders, weak police. Our police and our leaders tiptoe around this issue. This issue is political Islam. It's political Islam that's spreading across this country.
Georgia Calvin-Smith, Britain with a far right that's much, much smaller than it is in France. What's the trend right now when you, as far as what's the trend in terms of how much traction will a group like this get, this far right group?
Unfortunately, I think they're two sides of the same coin. Acts like this perpetrated by people who somehow manage to rationalize to themselves that crazy acts will somehow make some kind of wider point that will be accepted by wider society, feed directly into the anger and frustration and kind of radicalism of those who point the finger at them and say, this is the problem for everything that's going wrong in my life. So there is no doubt that acts like this are going to engender the kind of demonstrations that we saw from a pretty small cell, but people who even without this are feeling like they know what the problem is with Britain's economic troubles, with the fact they can't find a job, with the fact that they're having issues with getting housing. So I don't think it necessarily says much outside of the context of that pre-existing dialogue between the far right element that thinks that immigration is at the center of everything that's wrong with the country, and those on the other side who think that everything that's wrong with the country is because of foreign policy in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan or Mali or the like.
All right, and certainly this playing up to those who feed off of polarization. I want to thank you very much, Georgia Calvin-Smith. I want to thank Farhad Khosrow-Kavar, Brooke Rogers for joining us from London, as well as Frank Foley in Madrid. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 today.